just a couple of minutes after the hour, so why don't I get us started? So thank you all for joining. This is the next workshop for primarily editors, but of course everybody's welcome, for the Coalition on Publishing Data in the Earth and Space Sciences. And I'm really excited about this particular topic. It's been a challenging one for the last, for editors everywhere on what it means to actually preserve, decide what to preserve when it comes to models and model data. And Gretchen and Doug and Matt have all been working on this now very earnestly for the last year, definitely, and more than that, I know previously, trying to figure it out. And I'm delighted to have them as our speakers today. So they all are at NCAR. Although Gretchen just most recently joining NCAR. So Gretchen Mullendore and Doug Schuster and Matt Mayernik. We also have Stephen Griffies with us, who's our editor-in-chief for James. And he will help round out the conversation as someone who's trying to actually use the rubric and is newly introduced to it. So I'm glad he's with us here as well. So thanks, Stephen. And who should I hand to? Doug, should I hand to you?
Yeah, you can hand to me, and then actually Gretchen's going to kick it off. So thanks for the introduction and for inviting us to present to this group, Shelley. I think it is a very important topic and something that needs to be figured out. So I'm going to share my screen, and then I'm going to hand it off over to Gretchen for her to start. And the way we're going to do this is Gretchen's going to present an introduction to the project. I'm going to go over the rubric itself. And then Matt's going to look at some of the emerging themes that have come out of the project so far. So I'll share my screen now and hand it off to Gretchen. Okay, Gretchen, did you see that?
Yeah, looks great. I second the thanks that Doug said for inviting us to present. And yeah, I'm now NCAR, but started this project at University of North Dakota and still have affiliation with them as well. So this is I am going to just give an overview here. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So what is our motivation? So we all know that this is preaching to the choir here, that the open access expectations have really been evolving a lot recently. And so there's been a lot of work going on in making sure that there's clear expectations on data management requirements for both proposals and for publications. But the data management requirements for simulation output have not been very clear. My background is in modeling. I'm a researcher who does modeling studies and things like, oh, what if we look at the sensitivity of supercells to the environment? So but I'm also very interested in data accessibility, big data, data management. And so I was going to meetings and hearing about what are we doing for data repositories, but it was all focused on observational. And that makes sense. That's where everything started, because of course we need to save all the observational data. We can't get it back. But the rules for model data were very unclear. Next slide, please. And so we, at one of these workshops, actually organized by Matt and Doug, we all got talking, and I was talking to other attendees as well. And really the question was, what do we do about model data? And we knew the answer is not preserve all of the data. That's just untenable. So because too expensive due to large data volumes, and really not all model outputs are relevant to a research topic or needed to communicate knowledge. So we knew this was not preserve everything is not the answer, but how do we decide what is the answer? Next slide. And so we proposed an Earth-cubed RCN project. So I sort of skipped that on the first slide, but this is the NSF Earth-cubed project to bring together a diverse group of modeling experts to develop simulation output preservation guidance. So our proposal was to first develop a comprehensive list of simulation descriptors. And then we would use those descriptors to build a rubric and based on, and to sort of put projects into different classes of, how much data they should be saving. The idea is to refine this rubric with extensive set of use cases, and then finally disseminate these best practices to the broader community. All right, next slide, please. So what did we started this project with having some community workshops. So the first workshop that we had was in May 2020. So we ended up with all online workshops so far. And the participants for this workshop we had experienced modelers from a wide range of disciplines. And so that included oceanography, hydrology, lots of atmospheric science, from weather to climate, operations, also data and technology experts, publishers and editors. And we also made sure to include graduate students in early career to get a broad range of perspectives. And so this first workshop over these days, we really brainstormed, how do we talk about our models? Like, from the modelers, what do we do to describe our models? We ended up with a descriptor list from all this brainstorming. We had 102 descriptors, which would make a very unwieldy rubric. So then we worked over that workshop to pare it down. We ended up with 17 descriptors. And that paring down process partially was that, of course, some of the descriptors sort of were adjacent and could be rolled into one. But also I wanted to mention that a lot of the descriptors ended up to be very much value judgments, like, this data is valuable. And we realized, that we can't have those kinds of descriptors because, again, myself as a modeler, all modelers think all of their data is valuable and extremely valuable to the whole community. So we had to get rid of those value judgments. So we ended up with 17 good descriptors. These were also organized by theme, and the product of this first workshop was a draft of the model rubric. Next slide. And so first we realized that there are things we want to preserve for all projects. So before going into a little bit about the rubric, so unless publicly available from another provider, everyone should be, all model simulation studies should be saving the code, initialization data, the simulation setup. So for example, what parameterizations are you choosing, pre-processing code and the post-processing code, and make those open. So there'll be talk later on some of the barriers to having all this be shared, which is proprietary code and data. For instance, operational centers, not everything's available. There's also access issues with the size of this data. And there's also cultural resistance, which again, will be talked about more later. Next slide. And so we also realized we have to define who is this rubric for. And so this is our definition of the user. A researcher determining simulation outputs that should be deposited in a fair, aligned community repository to communicate knowledge. And so notice that this is what goes into repository. We're not trying to tell researchers what to keep or not keep on their own disks. This is what gets shared. And again, as a researcher in modeling myself, that was an important distinction because, yeah, we all want to keep all of our data as long as we can. But my method up till this project of how much data do I keep is just, well, I fill up the disk and then I figure out some stuff I need to erase and repeat. And I also went into this project thinking, oh, I think, and again, many of my colleagues too, I want to find a way that people could use this data for lots of other stuff, but that's really, again, not a tenable solution. Most data is used for one project and then should be aggressively culled in this era of big data. So that was something, a strong message coming out of these workshops. All right, next slide. So here is a very brief example of the rubric. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because Doug next up is going to really give an extensive description of our rubric and our use cases. But this is just to give you an idea of what it's going to look like. So for instance, a descriptor might be computational cost. And if it's a small cost, you end up in class 1. If you're a very high computational cost, you end up in class 3. And class 3 means that it's harder to replicate or rerun, and class 1 is much easier to do. And so class 3, you'd end up preserving more output possibly, and class 1 would be less. And then you work through all of the 17 descriptors. Next slide. All right, so that was our product out of workshop number 1. Workshop number 2 was August of 2020, and we had about the same number of participants, around 40 to 50. And I didn't put the participant list here. It was the same group, diverse types of modelers, publishers, technology experts again. And so what we asked was people come into this workshop, and it had some of the same participants, but also different participants, and they came into this workshop with a use case from their own experience. So what is something that was trying to be published or was published, and then we wanted to use these use cases to refine the rubric, but then we also wanted to start building a database of these use cases. So so what we have here, I also want to mention that this workshop, we really delved more into emerging ideas, which again, I'll mention a little bit more about in a second. So the first product that came out of this was examples for different use cases. We actually have many use cases that were discussed at this workshop, but we have sort of 3 working use cases to start with right now, where we have, those are available on our website, where we have a low score, preserve few outputs, a middle score, preserve some selected outputs, and then a high score, preserve majority of the outputs from the simulation. And again, Doug's going to show more details on that, so I'm not going to go into details there. But we also came out of this as a use case template, so that we can, and we already have more folks that we're working with to add their use cases into our database. And we welcome this, because what I really learned from this is, like, I'm somebody who often works in the first category of a low rubric score, again, doing sensitivity studies, highly accessible input data and model code. So for instance, I'm using CM1 or WRF. But then even in there, there's a lot of variability between the cases. And so once you find out where your score is and have thought through the kind of data that you have, it's really useful to see details on the template of, like, oh, here's what this project was and the choices they made, and here's how I can apply that to my own case. So we're excited to be building out this database. I also wanted to mention, this is not publicly available yet, but I thought this group might be interested in this, is that we, and working with our steering committee, which somehow that slide didn't show up, but we have a steering committee from a broad range of disciplines, and we were challenged to be more, really be inclusive in our template and anti-racist. And so we're working on a new broader impact section to encourage data sharing decisions to be more inclusive, along with providing accessibility and replicability. All right, next slide. All right, so finally, I just want to mention these emerging ideas. Matt is going to extensively discuss these, but some of the emerging ideas he'll be discussing later in this presentation is that we need a coordinated effort to assist researchers in data curation. They're doing a lot of data curation themselves, which is not their expertise area. Replicability and reproducibility are different, and replicability is really the goal of most research, not, say, bitwise reproducibility. Knowledge production versus data production, a very important distinction, and most research is really knowledge production, meaning that very little output needs to be saved, but data production, they need to be thinking that of their projects in a different way and making sure resources are available for their projects. Cultural barriers are really impeding modelers from embracing open software and open data, and which again, Matt will talk about more. And then finally, that no individual technology is going to solve all our needs. Say cloud storage gets talked about a lot, but that is, without good curation, is not going to solve our problems. All right, next slide. Take it away, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Gretchen. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the rubric and some of the reference use cases that Gretchen mentioned. And I'll just provide some perspective of where I came from into this project. So I manage a group at NCAR that maintains a repository. And we had a lot of requests from NCAR researchers kind of at the last minute to take model data that'd be in the tens to sometimes hundreds of terabytes and say, can you take this and archive this because we need to publish a paper and there are requirements for us to share all our data. And that type of workflow wasn't sustainable from a human resources or infrastructure standpoint to get these last minute requests for tens of terabytes to hundreds of terabytes of data to be archived. And lots of times it wasn't in a format that was reusable. So that's why I was drawn to this project and feel it's important, especially if we can get to the point where really what we found so far in some of these workshops, as Gretchen mentioned, it's really important to share the code and workflow components in a lot of cases versus all of the large model outputs. So anyway, that's a little context of where I'm coming from. So next I'll go into what does the rubric look like and what are some of these reference use cases that were mentioned. So just as a reminder, we went through this process in workshop one. We had to come up with a definition who the audience is and what the purpose is for this rubric. And as Gretchen mentioned, there was actually a lot of different, we iterated through a lot of use cases where what do I need to preserve at this step of my workflow versus the end of the workflow, et cetera. So we really wanted to focus on assisting the researcher in determining what simulation outputs should be deposited in a Fairline community repository to communicate knowledge. And really part of this point is when they're coming up with a data management plan, hopefully they could use the rubric to come up with an estimate of what data they need to preserve. And then if they have to end up paying a repository or a service to preserve that data once it's available through their project cycle, they have those resources available to do so. So it's really part of the planning process when they're starting a project, hopefully. So in terms of the rubric structure, as Gretchen mentioned, we have a number of themes, 8 different themes that we've broken out into sections within the rubric, and the rubric's just basically a spreadsheet at this point. But we wanted to break it out into different themes so a researcher can score each theme accordingly and add weights that can be tailored to their project needs. So each theme has a big picture question. There are the simulation descriptors that Gretchen mentioned that hopefully feed into answering that bigger picture question in terms of preserve less output or preserve more output. And basically, there are scores that are totaled for each row in this spreadsheet for each descriptor. And in the end, you get a total score. And from that total score, you get a recommendation on preserve less output, preserve some output, or preserve more output. And I'll discuss that in a little bit. So this is the basic structure of each section of the rubric. So next I'll go into a brief example of what one of these sections looks like. So a broader theme that the rubric tries to interrogate is cost. And what it's really looking for is it more costly to rerun a full simulation workflow or preserve model output products in a Fairline repository? It's really trying to quantitatively get at this question versus just asking this question. So this is actually broken out into a couple of what we call the simulation descriptor themes that I just showed the structure for. So you look into the cost of running a simulation workflow. In this case, the big picture question is, what is the cost to produce your simulation workflow outputs? And then we compare that to the repository data management services cost. And this would be the expected repository data management services cost. In this case, for these large model outputs, it's not necessarily free to deposit these in a repository. So what does it cost for you to archive the output in a Fairline community repository? And then also preserve and provide access to your simulation workflow outputs for a minimum period of time. So this is also another issue that came up in the workshops, is how long do these model outputs have value to the community? The default time that's set in place by a lot of publishers at this point is a minimum of 5 years of preservation. So that's what I'm talking about for minimum period of time. So typically when you deposit something in a repository, it costs so much in terms of storage per volume per year. So multiply your volume times that times the number of years and you get a number for the total cost. So here's what the cost of running the simulation workflow looks like in the section that we have in the rubric. So the big picture question that I mentioned earlier. Then we have the simulation descriptors and the simulation descriptor class components. Then we have the descriptors themselves. In this case, there are a couple of descriptors that try to get at this question. Well, the first one is computational cost of running the simulation workflow. So the user of the rubric would choose class 1 if their workflow requires small computational costs and no special platform needs. And in the case that it requires high computational cost or need for a large or specialized compute platform, such as an HPC, high performance compute system, they choose class 3. And then to the right of this, they'd have a box where they could enter the score, and then there'd be a weighting option, and they get a final score for that row. So basically, if they choose class 3, as Gretchen mentioned, that'll weight their score towards preserve more output because it's hard to more challenging to rerun the simulation based on that descriptor. There's also a human resource cost of producing the simulation workflow output. So if there's trivial effort required, it's easy to spin up and run simulation for most end users with disciplinary experience. They'd choose class 1, which is preserve less output. And then on the flip side, if it takes a lot of human resource time to get a simulation ready to run and then go through and actually execute a simulation to replicate it, you'd choose class 3 because it's probably more cost effective to preserve the output versus rerunning the simulation. So you can kind of get a feel for how the rubric works through one of these sections by doing so. And then I also wanted to include an example of what the repository data management services cost looks like. So the big picture question we have is, what is the cost for you to archive the output in a Fairline community repository? For this section, there's only one descriptor that was come up with through the workshops. So we have the repository supported data curation cost. Once again, it's class 1. The user would choose class 1 if community repository expenses are prohibitive due to large volume of the expected model outputs. So that weights you more towards preserve less output. It's not cost effective to preserve your tens of terabytes of output in a repository for 5 years. If it's relatively inexpensive, depending on the repository resources that you have available or where you can deposit the data or the size of your data, then it's recommended to preserve more output because it's more cost effective to do it that way. So you can kind of see how we try to balance different themes out through the rubric. And then in the end, we come up with an aggregate score, which I'll go into in a couple of slides. So the big picture themes that we try to get at quantitatively through the rubric are community commitment. So this question looks at, does a project fall into the data production or knowledge production category? And that's really at the beginning of the rubric, and Matt will describe a bit more in his slide set what data production or knowledge production are, but the rubric is more geared towards knowledge production. And data production, those are projects such as the climate intercomparison project, where international centers run a number of climate model runs across the globe, and the end goal of that is actually for end users to use the data for scientific research, not just the PIs of that project. So broad collection of end users. Another theme is research workflow accessibility. So the question we're trying to answer there is, would it be reasonable to expect others with discipline-specific knowledge to rerun a full simulation workflow? So you can kind of see what we were looking at with cost for that component as well. But if it is reasonable and relatively easy for others to rerun a full simulation workflow, then the rubric weights the score towards preserve less output in those questions. For data accessibility, would it be reasonable to expect others to access and use simulation workflow outputs? For that question, you have the same thing. If it's challenging for others to access and use simulation workflow outputs due to the size of the volume, the accessibility that's provided through a repository, or if the outputs are stored in some kind of a proprietary format, we might lean more towards rerunning the simulation workflow in that case. If it's easy for others to reuse data, that weights the rubric score towards preserving more output. Another category is research feature reproducibility. Are physical features generated by a simulation reproducible? So this deals with factors of nonlinearity that are in computational code. So if you're producing physical features that are really challenging to be reproduced through a simulation due to nonlinearities, the rubric would weight the score towards preserving more output so that users of your research products can see the feature that you generated through your simulation, which would be challenging to do by rerunning it. And then finally, we have cost, which we just talked about. Is it more costly to rerun a full simulation workflow or preserve model output products in a repository? So you put all these together and you come up with an aggregate score in the end once a user works through the rubric. And this is actually a snapshot from the bottom of the spreadsheet. So we have 3 different bins at this point. And I'll just mention all of this is still a work in progress, and we plan on having additional workshops once we can meet in person next year to go through this further. But the way we've come up with this so far is we have 3 bins where if you have a weighted score of under 48, the recommendation is to preserve few simulation outputs. If your score falls in the middle, you're recommended to preserve selected simulation workflow outputs. And then finally, if you have a score greater than 72 in this case, it's recommended through the rubric that you preserve the majority of simulation workflow outputs. Then we have actual use cases that you can link to according to each bin, whatever bin that you might fall in, as Gretchen mentioned, so you can see what others have done when they've come up with a similar score in that score range. And I'll also mention that the rubric itself, it is a bit complicated. So we have a detailed set of instructions for users actually to enter into this and go through the workflow. We're gonna continue to work on those as well in the next few workshops, as well as, you know, adding a more robust set of reference use cases. So here's the example for use case 1. In this use case, we have an idealized process study where the goal is knowledge production. And the recommendation is to preserve and share information, configuration, and codes. And they're really, through this use case, were no output data expectations to be preserved in a community repository. And through the use case documents, excuse me, the dog's getting a little wild here. Through the use case documents, there are very detailed descriptions on data that was produced through this study, data that was discarded, not preserved in the community repository, the amount of data that was required for input, boundary conditions, and all those things. So if you want to dig deep into these, I'd recommend going into the documentation that's available on our website. So for use case 2, this is another atmospheric science-based use case. We had a lot of atmospheric scientists as well as hydrologists at our workshops. But for this one, the recommendation is to preserve and share input data, simulation configuration and codes, and a portion of the process model output. And there were some files that were saved in the form of summary files, which were a fraction of the raw output. So once again, we're just trying to give users a feel for what they should preserve based on some of these reference use cases. And then finally, we had a use case 3, which is modeling ammonia in the atmosphere. So as you're feeling, you can see some of the repetition here. Preserve and share simulation, configuration, and codes. And in this case, process model output related to ammonia. So this was a private sector use case actually, where it was geared more towards data production and end users using their data products. And that's described, as I said, much better in the actual document that describes the use case. But this gives you a feel for how these look, and we're actually working with researchers right now that we're at some of the workshops to add to these use cases. So we have more use cases for each bin, and users have more of a selection that they can look at and hopefully get a better feel for what they might need to preserve based on their rubric score. So that concludes my section at this point, and I'll hand it off to Matt.
All right, thanks, Doug. You can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Great. So I'm going to pick back up on a few topics that have been discussed or just introduced briefly by Gretchen and touched on by Doug. And these are topics that are sort of a bit more high level. So Doug really dove into the details of what we're trying to build in terms of a product, but we're also encountering some issues that are, I think, interesting and important to just sort of be aware of, and have been important to our discussions. And the first one as shown here is just this issue that Gretchen touched on, that replicability and reproducibility are often used somewhat interchangeably in some of our discussions about open data, and they're clearly important motivators for a lot of the work in this space and for a lot of the policy work around open data and open software. But I think what came clear pretty quickly in our project is that the sort of bitwise reproducibility issue, which often gets discussed in relation to simulations, was not very useful for the discussions we were having at our workshop. In workshop 1, we started talking about that and it quickly got set aside in favor of the issue of the feature reproducibility that Doug talked about, which is more of replicability in the definition from this reference number 1, which is a nice report written recently by the National Academies. And the idea there is that the features of the physical system, whatever they might be, are being produced by the simulation. Can those features or the sort of outcomes of the simulation be replicated more than can the bits themselves be recreated? It was a lot more valuable to think about it in terms of the feature reproducibility or the replicability than the sort of bitwise stuff. And there's various reasons for that, and it's been discussed in both of these reports that are linked here, so won't go too far into it. But essentially the idea is that, especially for complex types of projects, simulations that are studying nonlinear phenomena, it's actually not that useful to reproduce the bits. As one person commented, findings that only work when bit reproducibility is needed are problematic for others to build on. So we'll go to the next slide, please. The next one is this knowledge production versus data production idea that's been discussed a few times already. And this image is coming from a paper that I co-authored with my colleague Karen Baker from the University of Illinois, who's an expert in ecological data management. But the idea here, I think this framing's been useful for our project as well. The idea is that data production and knowledge production, as shown in the figure, although they're quite intertwined, they involve different kinds of work and they're sort of a different end goal, right? And projects need to be oriented towards one of those two or both of those two from the beginning. It's no matter which path you go down, the data production path or the knowledge production path, it's difficult to sort of flip to the other path once you're down towards the end of it. And so, a lot of scientific research is published in scientific journals, right? The goal is knowledge production. And so there's lots of work with data, but that work is oriented towards the knowledge, right? It's the cleaning, the interpretation, the figures, the presentation of the findings, the peer review. And it's less about the work that needs to happen on the data production side, which might be the metadata, the packaging, the preservation, the archiving, identification, and that kind of stuff. And so I think what we've been using this framing for in our project, as you've sort of heard, is to think about, well, what is the orientation of the projects we're talking about? Because there are certainly projects that are very much data production, right? Their goal is to produce data sets that either a specific community can use or that anybody could use. And of course, there's a lot of projects where the goal is very much knowledge production, and the sort of whether data gets reused or not is just a sort of sideline consideration. So, projects can go down both paths, but it needs to be sort of an orientation from the beginning, not kind of an afterthought. So go on to the next slide, please. So there's lots of course, discussion of technology in this space, and there's lots of really valuable and useful things coming out of those discussions. But I think it's important to point out that there's not any single technology that's going to kind of solve this model problem, model data archiving problem. We talked about cloud storage a lot because of the volume issues and the transfer issues. Some of those issues are dealt with very nicely by cloud storage. But just putting something on the cloud is, no different from anonymous FTP in the sense of it's just sort of from an access point of view. Without stewardship and curation, you're still going to have potentially data that's hard to use and hard to understand, even if it's on a cloud system. And likewise with Jupyter notebooks and Jupyter-based environments, they're really fantastic for transparency, reproducibility types of questions. But again, they can be really poor from a curation point of view, and they're dependent on environments that themselves need to have curation support for. I was on a paper that produced a Jupyter notebook, but and we put it in Zenodo, but less than a year later, I wouldn't have been able to open that Jupyter notebook myself because I got a new computer and my environment was totally different. So I would have needed to do a lot of work to get that environment going again. And so that kind of leads to the next point, which is highlighted on the next slide, which is about data curation personnel is an important consideration that came up in a number of times. So go ahead to the next slide, please, Doug. So as Gretchen touched on at the beginning, and this kind of relates to the data versus knowledge production idea, if your orientation towards your work is knowledge production and you're not thinking about data production, data curation can be a big challenge. And it can be, of course, even if you are thinking about the data production side of things. And so I think that the expectation that everyone is archiving their data and preserving their data and curating their data doesn't really track with the expertise and the sort of personnel to do that across the research institutions. So researchers do spend a lot of time dealing with data curation, which might be a difficult or sort of side task for them that they're not really wanting to spend time on. There are lots of repositories in the atmospheric sciences, but they're to say uneven in terms of their support and what they are able to take. And so it's again sort of uneven support for curation across those repository framework. And so we've had some discussions in our workshops about what would it be like to have more personnel to assist in data curation, more investment in repositories and stewardship services, and what that might look like. A previous project, so a preliminary previous project to the current one, which we wrote a report on a couple of years ago, we identified just a couple of kind of thoughts towards data curation and kind of the repository space. And so I just highlighted those here. We don't need to go too far into them unless there's interest in discussing them, but there are lots of repositories. We could scale those up. We could look at the non-specialized data repositories like the Zenodo and Figshare types of services to see if there's ways that those can augment some of the more disciplinary services, especially around sort of large scale data and some of the types of data we've talked about here. There are quite a few folks in the data librarian space who already work with researchers in their own communities. Is there ways to kind of coordinate with those to think about liaison services for data repositories? I think that's just kind of an open-ended question. And then of course we could look at, are there new repository services that could be funded? And if so, who would have the financial support to do that? So go to the next slide, please. And then this is the last slide of this particular kind of overview section around cultural barriers. And these come up in every meeting where we talk about anything related to software in particular, but data as well. So, the sort of challenge here is that researchers are often rewarded for producing publications and in some cases for withholding data, right? Maybe not directly, but if you can have sort of a publication advantage by having unique data or unique software, from a publication point of view, that actually might be a good thing. But from an open science point of view, right, that's a barrier. So this shouldn't be any surprise to most of you, but rewarding good data and software sharing practices in addition to good publications is a cultural shift that might be happening a little bit, but certainly needs to go farther. But I think another point which Gretchen touched on earlier on is that we often don't think about it this way, but there's ethical issues around open data and open software that I think need to be discussed more. And that's that withholding data and software does perpetuate inequalities and limit scientific opportunities, right? There's known biases with who gets grants and who gets through peer review and publications. And those kinds of things, right, are sort of how people get access to resources to do new software, right, and new data. And so there are definitely equity issues in preventing access to data and software for people who don't have access to the grants or the journals that everyone else does, or who don't have bandwidth or storage to deal with data themselves, or who don't have relationships with authors of articles to request personal through personal means direct contact with people to get access to data sort of in offline ways. So I think we're just trying to elevate that issue. It's come up in some of our discussions, and we want to point out that it's not just about sort of facilitating faster science. It's also facilitating opportunities for people who, for various reasons, currently are not well supported by these landscapes. So if you go to the next slide, then Doug, this is just kind of a summary of that, right? And I won't sort of beat these down again, but we need to be thinking about our terms, be thinking about our concepts, be thinking about how technologies are important, but not the only solution. You know, how does curation fit into this? And then these sort of cultural barriers around open software. So I think if we go to the next slide, then just quick highlight a couple things, and then I think we'll turn it over to Stephen for his input. So we have been doing some workshops. We're engaging with folks such as yourself. We've got a couple more presentations coming up at the EarthCube annual meeting next month. We're looking at additional workshops. So if you are interested in working on these topics more, you can see Doug's email here. You can contact us. We've got a mailing list for our project. And we kind of use that for invites when we get to the point of workshops. You know, we're planning to work on a paper with some of these overview topics pretty soon. I think, one other thing that I'll highlight here, sorry, just go back a second, Doug, actually, maybe you can go forward one slide and now you can just say it on the next slide, is the rubric itself. You know, we've been working on it in a particular form, but we've already seen at least one, and I think a couple examples that we've heard of from people who attended our workshops who took the rubric and these sort of descriptors and customized it in some way for their own local environment. And so I think that's very much something we would encourage is, you know, if you're interested in this, to, you know, maybe take ours as a starting point. And, you know, if it works for you, that's great. But if there's some sort of customization or adjustment to it that helps you in your sort of discussions in your organization, that'd be great. The specific use case that came up around that was some folks had a multi-model sort of project where they were, you know, model A, input to model B, input to model C, input to model D, and then the outcome was some product. And they were using the rubric at each step in that sort of multi-stage process to look at, you know, which of the intermediate products do we need to keep around and for how long. So there could be a number of cases that might be useful. I think that's all I wanted to say. I don't know if Gretchen, you want to say anything else, or we'd turn it over to Stephen.
No, I think that was great. Thanks, Doug and Matt, and Stephen, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have anything prepared. I was taking lots of notes, and again, I'm a new chief editor of an AGU journal, Journal of Advances in Modeling Earth Systems, and it's a journal that is largely filled with theoretical and computational papers. So computer software, computer output, simulation output is fundamental to James. And so data accessibility and software accessibility questions are high on our list of priorities. And so I really learned a lot with the presentations thus far. I really like the distinction between replicability versus reproducibility. I can't even see it. Replicate versus reproduce, and knowledge versus data. One of the things that, so I'm going to really mostly have questions and maybe to prompt the experts, the people that have been thinking about this a lot longer than me. One of the things that an editor is confronted with a lot is authors asking them what sort of data and how much data to save from simulations. And the rubric is a great step forward. It's still hard for me as an editor to answer that question objectively or really specifically. And you know, I would largely have to trust the authors to go through the rubric and honestly answer this and say, look, I uploaded what I think is necessary to replicate my work and to expose the underlying science that was behind the work, or the data that's behind the work. One of the hopes, I think, is that over time we're going to get authors, myself included, I'm of course an author as well as an editor, to want to do this, to want to save the output in a way that is, especially for the knowledge production papers. You know, I participate in a lot of these data production projects too for the Climate Model Intercomparison Project, and that's a huge industry of petabytes of data that's out there for research to grab and to explore and to do science that is not directly tied to the person that uploaded the data. That's a resource for the whole community. What is more nebulous to me as an editor is those knowledge data production knowledge papers, which James is really mostly a knowledge journal, enhancing our understanding sorts of journal. And so you have people that are running simulations on their laptops or their PCs or their supercomputers that are one-offs that are targeting a hypothesis, science question, and they're not necessarily out there for the data production problem. And is the aim for the editor, is the aim for the journal to ask the author to provide enough data for another researcher to explore their work, or just enough data to reproduce the figures in the paper? If in just a specific example, you run a large climate model, you run it for hundreds of years, and you save a time average of, say, a 30-year time average of the surface temperature of the globe. Okay, well, clearly that surface temperature time average was produced by each time step of the model going forward and producing output, and then you accumulate that output and you save it to produce a one map. And if that's the map you produce for the paper, then one argument is that's all the data you need to provide to the community. Another argument is, well, you need to provide enough data for somebody else to explore that field and to do other statistical analysis with that field. I'm not sure where I sit. I sit more on the side of, if it's sufficient for producing the figure, let's ask the author to provide that. But it's to me a part of the nebulous, the uncertainty in that guidance. So yeah, the 5 years, it's great to have a number, 5 years minimum preservation time, because that's like, authors are asking those questions. How long, what should I do? Should I send it to, Iceland or Norway, where they're preserving things for hundreds of years? What use is that for simulation output? I like the point, I think it was Matt or somebody that said, look, my Python notebook won't work, my Jupyter notebook won't work for another, in a year because I upgrade stuff. One of the things that, and so that's a real limitation, I think, because a lot of the more important software that I'm asking authors to provide is the software they use for the analysis of their output. I don't necessarily care so much about the output as I often care more about the software used to run the model, to produce the simulation output, and to analyze the output. The notebooks are really, really useful because another student or postdoc or author comes along behind them and has a simulation that is very similar to you, but it's not the same code, but they want to reproduce the analysis in a way that's close to, if not the same as what this paper that they're looking at did. That is, in my mind, a great example of to replicate a piece of research without actually having anything except for the paper and an example Python notebook. And if people don't upload their notebooks, their analysis code to a repository, even if it doesn't work anymore, at least somebody can look at that output or that software analysis code. That's valuable. And so we are emphasizing that in our requests for the AGU. We're in the process of writing the AGU's data and software policy. It's being updated as we speak with Shelley and Chris and myself and other editors. And there's, of course, across the AGU, there's more than just simulations. There's actual field data. And in many ways, that's the most valuable data there is. It's field measurements, the stuff that you can't go back and grab again. You can't just rerun a simulation. And so the software output, the simulation output, is kind of a lower tier, but it's nonetheless incredibly important. So those are just really some comments and thoughts. And if any of what I just said resonates with anybody that's been thinking about this, any of the three speakers, because you've had two or three workshops, that sounds like you've made a lot of progress. And this model data rcn.github.io is definitely a site that I'm going to hopefully point people to with this model rubric I find that to be a great start. It may be sufficient for lots of purposes, but again, you know, when the rubber hits the road for an editor, you get this email from an author. It's like, well, how much should I save? And you know, it's a tough question to answer objectively. So that's all.
Thanks, Stephen. And also, there's a lot of great comments coming into the chat, which I agree with most everything that's being said. So I'm excited to discuss all this. But first, I just wanted to share. This is actually the use cases, like example, like the details of it. So, you know, your question, Stephen, about, you know, that's the challenge that we realized early on, was that there is no easy answer to how much data you save. There's so much variability in projects. And so what we were trying to do with this rubric is sort of to say, well, at least we can get you into a certain range of categories by going through the process of thinking about your data. And then once you're there, really looking at examples is I think the most helpful. And I don't want to go through all the details here, but this is for a knowledge production where you're going to discard most of the data. This turned out, Idealized Ryan was actually tropical cyclones, where we have the science goals workflow. But then if you scroll down, we like worked with, you know, what is the actual data being saved? You can see examples of the data and how much, the size of it. And because this particular project doesn't need that much actual outputs to be saved, it's more about the code and the processing. You can see a lot of 0 terabytes. Like there's really not that much to save. And then we get down, but then I also wanted to highlight, so yeah, the pre-processing stuff is what, or like the nameless file, where's the input data. These are the things that actually would be shared, because we don't need all the raw output at all. And they guessed that, you know, that's going to be saved on a local disk, 1 to 5 terabytes, but none of that's in a repository because it isn't necessary for this kind of work. And then, but then these are some interesting parts here of like, why should these things be preserved and shared? Trying to communicate, like have the person that filled out this template think about that, but then also communicate with new people coming into the system about why are these decisions being made? You know, so in general, in this case, it was sharing the code because there was a couple modifications to the code. It's a standard model, but there were some modifications, so that needed to be saved. And then some 2D diagnostic fields for some benchmarking, but we're not needing to do exact reproducibility. I also want to mention, Stephen, that I had to be on this project for like 6 months before I could say replicability. So, you know, it's only because I practiced a bunch. Anyway, but then expected intended audience. This is sort of what I think you're getting at, you know, with that question. So in this case, most likely users are colleagues or students conducting research in the same area. Follow on of the analysis is really the goal, not exact reproducibility. And so we might, we're still working on all this. And I think some of this stuff needs to be moved up top, right? Like before you even get into the details of how much of this data and how much of that, these are the important questions we're asking, is like, who is the user? And having examples like this. So the rubric you start with very more, leans more objective, where we're actually like, here, put some numbers in. But then we get to the subjective part where, but I think that if you're in a low score, like knowledge production for sensitivity studies, a lot of people are going to have an answer just like this. So we hope that as we get more use cases, we can get like, we like talked to our steering committee already, and we're like, okay, we have some reference cases. Who is not represented here? How do we need to flesh out this reference cases so that when people come into the system, they're like, oh, this one looks kind of like me. I can use this thought process to help me answer, because you as an editor don't have an easy answer for them. So I'll stop sharing now, but I wanted to give a little more detail on that part of the project.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly on that point. I think the way I'm thinking about it in terms of our goal to get more use cases is just like kind of highlighting what Gretchen just said, sort of have a platter of examples, right? Like any of these examples that we have now, which is 3, are probably not going to cover that many cases. But if we have, 4 or 5 cases within the knowledge production bucket and 4 or 5 cases within the data production bucket, and 4 or 5 in between, then there's sort of more examples that somebody can look at and to say, oh, I'm closer to this one, so maybe I'll sort of see if what they've done is similar to what might work well for my project.
That's exactly, that would be really valuable. In addition, instead of having to write it all up in the document yourself, just have a link to papers that follow a particular example. As papers come in and people start to follow these practices, here's an example of a paper which did this particular approach and that approach. There's nothing better than an example for people to follow.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And
you keep building up. Here's a bad example. Here's a good example. Maybe not bad example. People be embarrassed, but
you can take the names off.
Yeah. No, I'm thinking of just having the DOI link to the paper. Here's a paper to look at.
I think that's a great idea. A good example of an actual paper that does this well. One of the challenges that we brought up that I'm curious if others have any thoughts on is this challenge of dealing with cultural change. So it sounds, yeah, just share your model code and your data processing code and whatnot. But in my experience, there's quite a bit of resistance to that. And authors feel like this is an additional burden. It's pretty challenging because we just try to get things done, and not everybody uses software best practice strategies in their software development cycles in science. They might still put it in a directory with a date, Schuster dot 061595 or whatever. So that's a challenge as well. And Stephen, how have you dealt with this in terms of software sharing?
Yeah, it is cultural. James is kind of at the edge of the sort of sophistication of software usage, and most people use GitHub, and it's becoming common practice for people to have a GitHub link, and we're requesting that for all their software. For their output data, that's we're a little bit behind the software, but as I said already, I think for most papers, or for a number of the papers, the software is more important than the actual simulation results. It is a cultural shift, but grants are now requiring it. NSF and other agencies are requiring it, so people are starting to get it in their head, and the new generation in particular, the people that are more sophisticated technologically, it's just second nature now. I mean, you want to share your work in a way that allows for it to be replicated. And I'm hoping that maturity is going to continue. But not to sidestep it a little more, to point the finger, but it's the observational field people that are having, I think, the biggest difficulties. In oceanography, there's examples of data that hadn't been released for 20 years. And that's a real hindrance to the science. So I'm hoping that, I'm aware that the observationalists are getting more open access is much more important to them as well. And again, even for that community, software is relevant and software is important, and we need to encourage them to release and code repository their software.
Let me jump in. Maggie, I see that you have your hand up if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, so I'm not the publisher. I come more from the researcher and also research data management side. So I work in environmental and earth science related research infrastructure in Europe called ICOS. And we deal with observations of greenhouse gas data. And those are one of our main end user communities is modelers doing this inverse atmospheric modeling in order to produce maps over time and space to show where our greenhouse gases coming from and where are they being absorbed, so to speak, sources and sinks. And those groups, they tend to, up to now, have been extremely proprietary when it comes to the model codes, the details of that. Have been quite happy to share the outputs, etc., but they always want to keep a close eye on how these outputs are being used. So openly sharing has been difficult, but they're happy to share with people who want to put them as co-authors on their papers, and only in the last couple of years has this started to change now to be more open and be more well, sharing without any special ties and strings attached. But I do think that one of the issues here is also what is going on behind the scenes in these research groups that are doing the modeling. I've come to realize that many of the larger groups have actually quite bad internal management in terms of exactly the code versions that were used to produce what output for which paper, etc. So I think they need to get their act together internally before they can really leverage all of these rubrics and things that you have been talking about here. And I think the rubric and the questions can be an excellent training resource, so to speak, especially for the younger, the postdocs and the graduate students now, and really make them aware that in order to be fair, fairness starts even before you do your first research step. You must have this in your mind. You must realize which kind of metadata you should be collecting so that your provenance is correct for your own sake, let alone for anybody else down the pipeline. So I always, when I teach FAIR myself in research data management introductory courses, I stress this: FAIR is for you to start with, and then everything else will come along. And in the end, when it becomes a natural part of your research process, then this is just not any extra time, not any extra resource. It will just be rolling on, just like you are used to citing papers and citing bibliography and all of these things in the right way. Also making data citable, reusable, etc. It's just going to happen. Although I do think that the software part is going to take longer.
Thanks, Maggie. I think those are great comments. Just follow up on that if I can, Shelley. So I totally agree that I think the rubric potentially could be as useful or more useful for sort of internal purposes, at least as a starting point, as potentially to these questions about open sharing and the journal aspect. So I definitely encourage folks to kind of think of it in that regard. The other thing that you said, I think that's really important, is that there's a range of reasons why people may be either hesitant or unable to share data or software, ranging from, I don't think it's in good enough shape to, want to share it yet, to I don't want to share it because it's my sort of private thing, to I can't because there's some policy that prevents us from sharing it. So one case that came out there in one of our workshops was there was a participant from, I think it was a Naval Research Lab or one of the US Armed Forces research labs. And there's, legal reasons why they can't share code, right? It's national security considerations there. And so sharing the data output is kind of the only outcome that's possible, again, as long as they can sort of get through any restrictions in that regard. And so I think there's a little bit of that in the rubric, and Doug, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but around just sort of peer access questions, right? If the software is just not accessible for some reason such as that, well then, data sharing is kind of your option, right? Or vice versa, right? If there's reasons why data couldn't be shared, could the software be shared kind of in lieu of that? So sometimes you're just absolutely prevented from releasing something, but maybe there's something else you can do.
I also you're getting lots of +1s, Maggie, and me too, because, and I wanted to follow up on the statement about, it's so great talking to the next generation of scientists about this, right? But because it is them who are going to help us change the cultural barriers, but nicely, and you may have seen this in your own experience too, that they're already way more on board, right? Like as far as yes, open software, that makes sense. And I want to share things. And also the arguments for, the other side, which is really hard to make arguments against these equity arguments, right? Like we cannot do this. If someone's saying, oh, well, I'll make you a co-author, you just have to reach out to me and then I'll share my code. Well, there's a whole bunch of our community that either would not feel comfortable emailing that person or may not get an email back from that person because they're not known. And so, but again, the next generation, I was going to say, on our steering committee, we have some student members, and they're the ones that are pushing, our new efforts into even having more visibility for equity issues in the next version of the template that's going to come out. So thanks for your comments, Maggie.
I think Laurent has been waiting patiently, by the way. So
I just
Maggie,
answer with one sentence to what was just said. Hello?
Yeah, one sentence. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that young scientists will be a driving force, but I've also seen there that people who are just young graduate students and postdocs were run-of-the-mill ones, not the ones aiming to become the next Nobel Prize winners, right? They are generally very happy to share and to collaborate and all of these things. But it's the ones on the tenure track in that position, they are fighting with beaks and claws to prevent any kind of open sharing because they see this as a threat to themselves and their own careers. And they are the challenge.
Yeah, that's a problem with the way the tenure track reward system is structured, and that's a different topic, but people need to be rewarded for doing the right thing and sharing data and software openly. And that's a structural issue that Gretchen mentioned that, and I think Matt, currently they're rewarded for hoarding data and software in order to get the promotions. They can get all the papers and be co-authors and all these different things. So that's all I have to say. And then Laurent, thanks for waiting patiently.
Well, that's what I wanted to say. So waiting, now I don't have to say anything. No, but I was gonna actually, I had a few more points though on this because I had my hands up since Stephen's comments earlier, because I think he was representing a community that actually is quite mature and very strong about the software development things. And I don't know that it's representative of everybody around here. I know that we have a lot of software users, a lot of data users, and people who do software to complement data, but that may not always be their main stories. And so the experience is actually very different from what you're describing. Data has been shared in our community very well. And so I mean, 20 years old data, actually a lot of it is stored, but results are not, but okay. But software is very hard for some of the reasons that's been said there. And yes, we have a lot of mandates in places like NSF or even NASA, but not other places, or not every other founders. And I mean, I did have, for example, papers that says, you need to share this code. The paper is about the code. It says, no, my students spent 3 years developing that code. They're going to use it before anyone else can look at it. And this is actually, we've talked about equity. That's actually from a country that doesn't publish a whole lot. So that was kind of their point. It's like, you guys can share it because you have plenty. We don't. So we don't want anybody else. For once we found something that nobody else has, we keep it. And I also had a lot of people saying, I don't want people to use the software. Okay, I would have to make a lot of explanation about what it is. And I have whatever, that can be worked out. But they also don't trust people to use the software correctly. And there's been a fear in the community, like literally a fear. I have a lot of people who's telling me, if someone else take my code and use, crap out of it, I will take the blame. I was like, no, you won't. You're not the one doing it, but they feel they will because people will be misusing it in some way or another. And that's been some of the cultural changes we've been discussing. And I don't want to have get the idea that everybody is producing software. I mean, it's true that most of the younger people are more likely to be willing to share the code in general. That's fair. But there's a lot of resistance from people, and that's in every stage. Anyway, just one of my say.
Stephen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Laurent. I do appreciate that a lot of my community that I deal with is much more open than others, but it's still not perfect, of course. And I think that at journals like James and AGU in general, we should accommodate as best we can, based on editorial decisions, those people that are in a difficult situation, like what you said, where the ethical or equitability situation where you just got to accommodate those people that are stuck, unable to satisfy these ideals. But having said that, I try to push back against the big modeling centers, the weather centers that say, well, my code is not available to the outside world, it's behind a firewall, but you still should publish my work based on that code. That puts me in a difficult situation as an editor. Of course, I trust that they're not just making up the numbers, but it doesn't satisfy it doesn't, in my mind, optimize the advancement of the science of modeling when the code is not available. So I'm trying my best to push back against the people that have the resources but still resist releasing their code. It's becoming less and less, and the National Center for Environmental Prediction that I work with at NOAA is getting better with having code repositories and having their code available to the public. Open access modeling has been, since the 80s. It's a rite of passage today. If you run a model in many communities, if you run a model that's not on GitHub and available to the public, then it's looked down upon. It's not trusted. It's like you're hiding something. And it's in the current generation that I've seen, you go to a typical graduate student or postdoc's website, it's all GitHub and it's here are my projects. Please contribute if you want, comment on this. It's all open access in open development that is very encouraging, to the point that it's just overkill in the sense nobody has time to go through it all, but it's there. And it's something that the younger generation really is promoting. So I think that in my role, I'm going to do my best to push back when I have an author that says I can't make my software available. I think that that's not a viable excuse. If you want to publish in James, then that's going to be a difficult situation. But I think there's a whole grade of gray area there, and editors need to ultimately have the final decision. It's not something that you can black or white. It's an editorial decision still.
I want to answer this very quickly, because the problem though sometimes is the students want to do it, the advisor doesn't. And now when it's a big center, it's a different story, right? But I can think of specific research groups where the leader does not want to publish their code, has not want to do that for 20 years, and there's no intention of doing it. And so when their students are coming in with a new code, a new capacity of the code, and they're using it for the results, I'm like, what can you share? And I'm like, yeah. No.
So you as an editor, do you sort of say it's okay not sharing, or?
I mean, this is where we have to go with, okay, what can you give me? Because eventually I care about the results more than I care about the code, to be honest. At least in my journals, which is not a modeling focused journal, right? There's different groups, right? But eventually I'll take what they can give me, because I want us to publish those results. And okay, also that person being 20 years in there, we know that the code kind of works in a way. It's been very embedded, so there's a little bit of trust there. But yeah, I'll take what I can.
Yeah, that's where it's a gray area still. Yeah, fair enough.
Go ahead, Gretchen.
Yeah, so absolutely great comments, Laurent, that I see the same thing, where there are members of a group that are willing to sort of take a step in the direction of more openness, but they are being trained by people who've been working on their arguments for not sharing for a long time. But I also thought it was interesting, there's all kinds of arguments that I've heard for not to share, and I think everybody's been sharing a lot of these here. And I just want to make a more general statement about, so even just, we're getting into these bigger issues, or our project started just with the data, and then we realized software is so intricately tied with this issue of data accessibility that we got into discussing software accessibility as well. But just even the data, just trying to figure out what output do we save. I'd heard for a long time before starting this project, well, just you'd bring it up and then I'd hear like 20 different arguments for why this is an unsolvable problem. And in the 20 same arguments that I'd heard the last meeting I was at. And so I think we decided, like, look, this is not going to be a perfect process. This is a really, really complex problem. There's cultural issues, there's accessibility issues, there's there's career issues, there's the the complexity of the projects themselves, but we have to try something. And I mean, I think everybody on this call, everybody's trying something, right? And you as editors are like, look, it's complex. I'm not going to have a one size fits all, but at least we're trying something. And I just wanted to sort of say that I think we are making great progress as a group by at least saying things need to change and we've got to try something, and it's going to be okay if we make a couple mistakes or like, oh wait, you know what, that didn't work as well, let's assess. So I think an important part of this is, you know, also follow on how can we assess how this is working and then regroup and retry. And but as long as we keep trying stuff, we can make some progress on these really complex issues. And so that, again, thanks to everybody for trying.
Having the community stand up and say, this is what we think matters, you know, it is really important for, you know, anybody who's trying to promote preservation. So I have a question, and Pauline, I see your hand is up. Let me ask my question. Hopefully it's a short answer. We'll see what happens. So Gretchen and Matt and Doug, Chris and I were working on trying to operationalize this challenges around large data. And with your model, with your rubric, what you're talking about here is there are recommendations. You have certain categories recommending saving the output in various pieces that could be large. And can you help characterize the tipping point that you're seeing, or maybe from your own experience? Like, for instance, general repositories will take some terabytes for free, but then you hit costs. So where, like, is it at 5 terabytes? Is it at 10? What's our tipping point between something that's less costly to do versus higher cost versus there's just not a repository that'll do it? Like, do you have a sense for current possibilities, current capabilities?
Well, Shelley, I can just comment briefly on what we were doing at NCAR and maybe a few experiences that we've had elsewhere. But we've developed an internal, so NCAR, to support NCAR staff, kind of process for supporting data archiving requests. And our kind of tipping point, so to speak, is 1 terabyte. Under 1 terabyte, the costs are seen as, relatively speaking, minimal for storage, and we have repository services that can deal with that pretty easily. Over 1 terabyte, then there's sort of a cost mechanism that kicks in. So that's just what ours is, and that kind of was based on, you know, some calculations and you know, rates of storage, hardware and software, and personnel and things like that. But I think, you know, I mean, anything is you can deal with anything if you have dollars for it, right? I mean, petabytes is possible if you have, you know, the dollars to deal with it. So I think what we've been trying to encourage at NCAR is to be aware of what your potential storage needs might be from the beginning, so that especially if you're doing grant proposals, right, you can include those costs in your proposals. So that's kind of our consideration right now. I don't know, Doug, if you want to add to that, or Gretchen.
Well, I had a comment, and this has come up. I don't have an actual number, Shelley, but the idea of there being, you know, we have to take into account the costs as part of this, right? The actual financial costs. And so I actually wrote down this quote from one of our workshops because I thought it was great, from Josh Hacker, which was, we have best practices versus practical applicability, right? And so we made a conscious decision to really focus on what would be the best practices. So without taking resource availability into account for our framework. But actually, your question reminds me that, again, we have all this sort of big list of to-do items, is to maybe add back in this practical applicability issue back into our documentation, saying that there are all these issues. There's so much complexity here, and another vector of complexity is so I've done this whole thing and I looked at examples, and here's what I think that would be best for the community for me to have available in a repository. And it turns out I have no way to pay for this. So that comes into emerging themes, which is how as a community do we tackle this problem as we're trying to push for more access. Like, we don't have the solutions ready for everybody. There are not repositories that will fit with the best practices for all projects, especially smaller groups that don't have the financial resources. There's been several comments in the chat about making decisions up front. But then I think even there, like, you go to certain funding agencies, they're not used to seeing requests for repository costs in their proposals. And so that's just going to reduce them, so I think we did do a presentation to some program managers as well earlier, trying to bring up this issue of not just funding more curation personnel available to community, but also funding more free or reduced cost repository space. But that's a hot potato that didn't really go anywhere yet. But I think this is hopefully one of the important sort of bigger picture takeaways from this project, is that if we can come up with this framework, that's still not going to solve everything even close, because people don't have the resources to take advantage of it.
Well, I certainly would want to support that conversation. And I'm looking at the folks that are here. We've got folks from Springer Nature. We have folks from PNAS that are on, so other publishing houses. And I feel like we're at a point where we can try to funnel information back to you. Like, listen, we're trying to publish this person's research, and we want to comply with the rubric, but we're literally not able to because they didn't have the funds for the 5 terabytes of data that is recommended. Therefore, we had to make a different choice. And the flexibility that both what Stephen needs and his colleagues, within our journals and journals across the world have to have that flexibility, because the physical storage isn't available at the price tag that people have money for, researchers have money for, and they don't want to take away from their research. That it just needs to be. So I think that's definitely worthy, and having the rubric helps to say that out loud. Like, listen, we can't comply with what this community wants and is recommending. We need help. The community needs help. Pauline, I don't want to lose your question. I know you put your hand down. Did you still want to ask it?
No, I mean, you actually answered my question, so perfect.
Well, tell us what it was. So
it was about the storage of the data, the amount. Well, because I work at the SAUS for Canada and in the St. Lawrence region, and we are right now trying to deal with model outputs or even a complete data set, including the model data. So we have a huge amount of questions. This is why I am here, and thank you very much to everyone, because it's really interesting. And yes, so we are not the one that support the data. We're the one that just make the link between the owner of the data and the open to the public. And so yes, that's a question. How it's very costly, and how do we deal with that? Because there is a lot of owners that are actually really okay to share their data, but they don't know how to do it. So, but yes, it was. And also, I'm a young researcher, and just to say, we all agree to share our data, but often it's more the supervisor or the laboratory that are more containing us. Yeah, this one is working on the same subject, so maybe you should wait, just to say that the young generation is really ready, and send us help. We can make it. I mean, often it's just we don't have the knowledge, we don't really know how to do it, and our supervisor are not the one who's going to help. So, just to say.
So what you're saying is we should give you like a little pamphlet on what to hand to your supervisor, that yes, it's okay to share. the risks are lower than you think.
you know, during workshops or during the big, I work in biology, during the big biological workshop, just, you know, make sure that sharing is okay. You can share that, you know, be present, because often I feel that there is still this, you know, old stuff or not sharing data, but I mean, science is just based on sharing, because often you can see that other people are working on the same stuff than you, but just nobody shared. And it's going to be the same with code, with models, with stuff like that, especially models. It evolves so fast that we have to keep up to date.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. And I just want to comment that, yeah, I see that, again, reiterating, I see the same thing where there's a lot of buy-in, but then it's halted at some level for various reasons. And so having the institutions, the funding agencies and the publishers put rules in place can really help too, right? We have to just say this is required and we're going to enforce it, because then I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to argue with everybody that, oh, well, here's the issues from science, you know, speed to science, or equity issues, or, you know, whatever our argument may be. At some point, some people are just going to be, they're not going to do it unless you make them do it, because their whole career was successful because they hoarded data and software. And so, and also part of this issue is, again, the cultural issue of like, well, and I'm going to train everybody that works for me to be successful in exactly the same way I did it, which meant hoarding a lot of data and software. And so I do think there's this aspect of just forcing the change and partnering between, you know, the folks who can put rules in place is really important. You know, try to socialize why these are important changes to get people on board, but at some step, just going to have to make some people do it.
Well, and seeing that Mike Conway from NIH is on, and just really appreciating the fact that they've stepped forward with their new data sharing policy, and that's making a big difference, and that hopefully will influence other funders in the US, and of course the European Commission is pushing the importance of sharing data. ARDC in Australia is pushing the importance of sharing data. So just keep going. So thank you. So we've gotten to the end of our time. Can you believe how quick that went? Thank you so much to Gretchen and Doug and Matt and Stephen and everyone who's come. And please share this rubric with your communities. Give feedback to the team, keep the use cases going. If you've got a paper that's a great example, send that in to have to share as good links and to show best practices. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. If you're in the US or anywhere, really enjoy your weekend, but we have a long weekend, so we're looking forward to it. And it's the last day of school here, so I'm gonna go pick up my kid in an hour.
So, sounds like a great day to get ice cream.
It will be. I feel like that's on the agenda. All right. Thanks, Shelley, for hosting this.